Hey there, friends. Welcome to episode 236 of SelfKind with me, Erica Webb. A Tuesday tidbit for you today, and I want to share with you my favorite way of kind of interrupting the inner critic when it pops up. So stay tuned for that. So welcome, friends. What I want to share with you today is a really simple way to interrupt the inner critic when it is, doing its thing. I have talked a lot about the inner critic in recent times, and it's funny because as I'm recording this podcast episode, I'm thinking, have I already said this enough times? Am I repeating myself now? Is this getting annoying? But I use the very tool that I'm going to share with you today to kind of interrupt that and be like, no, sometimes often repetition is something that we all need as humans. The tools that I work with for myself and with my clients, I remind myself of constantly because that is often what we need. But the inner critic, part of the reason that I talk about this so often is because that inner critical voice is one of the things that can keep us feeling so incredibly stuck in stress and overwhelm and feeling like we're on the edge of burning out all the time. Because the inner critic is a source of stress. It's a source of threat to our system. And we forget that sometimes. I think we often think that the threats to our well-being are all coming from the outside. And oftentimes, a lot of the stress that we experience is coming from the fact that we are belittling ourselves, criticizing ourselves, telling ourselves that we're not good enough. And whilst that takes some effort to interrupt, there are some really simple things that we can do. And the tool that I want to share with you today is possibly the simplest and one of my favorites. So the tool is this. It's simply to say to yourself, oh, isn't that interesting? And then follow on with whatever the thing is that's interesting, right? So, to use the example of me being kind of concerned that maybe I'm being repetitive or saying something that people don't want to hear. Oh, isn't it interesting that I'm concerned about repeating myself and making the people who listen to the podcast frustrated? That's really interesting. And I find that this strategy, this tool, is quite effective at just opening up a little bit of space between the thought and what we do with it next. As I'm recording this, we have just wrapped up the first week of Soma Home, which is my brand new 6-week course. And we were talking about values in week 1, but I offered this tool up as a little strategy for self-criticism. And it's been incredibly useful for a lot of people. I've had some feedback about how useful this little sentence has been to interrupt the critic when it's kind of just like going off and doing its thing. And so I wanted to share it here today as the tidbit, because I think sometimes we think we have to make these huge, big rah-rah changes. And sometimes it is simple, little, regular things that can make a really big difference. So another example of this might be if after recording this, I watch it back and I see something about myself in the recording that I'm like, oh, why do you do that, right? Like, why do you constantly use this word? Why does your face do that thing when you speak? These are some of the things that come up, right? And so it might be in a moment like that being like, oh, isn't it interesting that I'm really concerned about how I look on screen? Isn't it interesting that I'm really concerned about the fact that I say this word on repeat? And by just saying those few little words, it gives us just some space, right? It's just this little opening, a crack, where we get to say, oh, I have more than one choice. I can move in more than one direction here, which is often the thing that the inner critic doesn't allow us to do. When the inner critic is like gripping onto us, it feels like our only option is to believe it and to kind of just stay on this track of like hearing that inner critic, or maybe not even hearing it. Sometimes we don't even hear it. We just like let it derail us. And so this is a method of diffusing from our thoughts. And diffusing really just means recognizing that we're not them, right? You are not your thoughts. Your thoughts are not always true and accurate reflections of reality. And it's a tool that is often used in acceptance and commitment therapy. And there's lots of ways to diffuse from your thoughts, but this is one of my favorites. The other way that we can do this is, instead of saying, isn't it interesting, we can say something like, oh, I'm having the thought that, fill in the gap. And both of these things just allow us to step back and be like, oh, I see this. I see what I'm doing. Not in a critical way. Oh, I see what I'm doing and, that's terrible. It's not that. It's more like, oh, interesting, curious. This is what's going on. Whereas so often we just let the inner critic be like, got you, and, run. So I hope this tool, whether you want to sort of say, oh, it's interesting, I'm having this thought that, or I'm having the thought that, or, oh, isn't it interesting that, right? Two different ways you can word it, and there's probably more as well. But I hope that you find that tool really helpful. Play with it, practice it. Let me know how you go. I will be back next week. Well, actually, I'll be back later this week, and we've actually got a wonderful guest for Thursday's podcast episode. I've brought in Trina Altman, who is a movement pro who I have admired from afar for a really long time, so I'm really excited to share that with you. One thing I will pop in the show notes for this Tuesday Tidbit episode is the wait list for the next round of Soma Home. As I mentioned, we're into week 2 now as this episode goes live, and I will be running the course again early in 2024. So if you want to pop your name on the wait list, I will pop the link to that on the website. Not on the website, it is on the website. In the show notes is where you'll find that. So just click through if you are curious about joining us next time. All right, until Thursday, keep being kind to yourselves. I'll talk to you again really soon.